You won't want to miss this. Before we jump in, hit subscribe, like this video, and drop a comment. Trust me, you'll be glad you did. Galen Stroud awoke to disorientation and a deep, unshakable ache radiating through his body. The flickering light above him cast jagged shadows against the metallic walls, giving the room an eerie, artificial glow. He tried to move, but his arms felt like lead, and the cold press of steel restraints bit into his wrists. As he took a deep breath, the acrid tang of ionized air filled his nostrils, making him cough. His head pounded, and his thoughts scrambled as he tried to recall how he'd ended up here. The last clear memory he had was of the ruins on Erios Prime. He had been examining the carvings of a long-extinct civilization, piecing together clues about their mysterious disappearance. Then there had been the artifact, a shimmering, obsidian sphere inscribed with symbols that pulsed with faint light. He'd reached out to touch it, despite his better judgment, and everything after that was a blur of light and sound. Now he was here, somewhere completely unfamiliar. A voice broke through the haze of his thoughts. Stay still. The command was low, cold, and carried an unmistakable authority. Before he could react, a hand pressed firmly on his chest, keeping him pinned against the chair. Instinctively, his muscles coiled to resist, but he froze when his gaze met the figure looming over him. Ashira Driva, a humanoid figure with skin like molten silver, stood mere inches away. The light reflected off her metallic complexion, creating an almost ethereal glow. Her eyes were dark voids, ringed with faint bioluminescent veins that pulsed softly. Midnight black hair was tied into a tight braid that cascaded over one shoulder, giving her an air of calculated precision. Galen's breath hitched as his mind processed the alien before him. This was not someone, or something, he'd seen before. "You're trespassing in Oriconis," she said flatly, her voice devoid of emotion. She reached for a sleek, handheld device and waved it over him. The device emitted a soft, melodic hum as it passed across his body. A faint beep followed, and she narrowed her eyes. No identification. No biological signature in our registries. Explain yourself. The weight of her gaze pinned him as firmly as her hand had moments ago. Galen's throat was dry, and when he spoke, his voice cracked. "I'd love to explain, but I haven't the faintest clue how I got here." Her brow furrowed, and she tilted her head slightly, studying him as if weighing the truth in his words. "Convenient," she muttered, slipping the scanner back into a holster on her belt. Her uniform was dark and form-fitting, with a high-collared design that added to her intimidating presence. A badge glinted on her chest, though the insignia was unfamiliar to him. She was clearly some kind of law enforcement, but her demeanor suggested far more experience than a standard officer. Ashira straightened, her hands resting on her hips. "You're in my custody now, human. Resistance won't be tolerated. Cooperate, and this will go smoothly." "Yeah, I doubt that," Galen muttered under his breath. He flexed his fingers, testing the restraints that bound him to the chair. They were strong, unyielding. Typical. Before Ashira could respond, a door slid open with a sharp hiss, and two more figures entered. They were similar to Ashira, with the same silver skin and dark eyes. Their uniforms, however, were slightly different, bulkier and clearly designed for combat. Each carried a pulsar rifle slung over their shoulder, and their movements were rigid, methodical. One of them nodded to Ashira. "The area is secured. No other intruders." Ashira's expression remained unreadable. Her focus didn't waver from Galen, and she leaned in slightly, her tone dipping lower. "Then that leaves us with a question." She placed her hands on the table separating them and met his gaze. "Who are you, and what are you doing in my city?" Galen's smirk returned, though it lacked its usual confidence. "I'd love to answer that, but unfortunately, I have no idea how I got here." Her lips pressed into a thin line, the first sign of irritation breaking through her otherwise stoic demeanor. She studied him for a moment longer, then straightened and reached for a device on her belt. Galen's eyes widened as the device crackled to life, emitting an arc of electricity. "Wait," he began, but it was too late. A sharp jolt surged through his body, locking his muscles and overwhelming his senses. His vision blurred, and the last thing he heard before darkness claimed him was Ashira muttering, "Then we'll do this the hard way." When Galen regained consciousness, the first thing he noticed was the cold. The chair beneath him was metal, uncomfortably rigid, and the restraints on his wrists and ankles had been replaced with something less conspicuous but equally unyielding. The room was dimly lit, and the air carried a faint metallic tang. His pulse hammered in his ears as he scanned his surroundings. He wasn't alone. Across from him stood Ashira, her arms crossed over her chest. Her expression was as cold and calculating as before. "You're awake," she said simply. "Great observation," Galen replied dryly, shifting slightly to test the new restraints. "You know, I was really hoping to wake up in a more comfortable place. Maybe with breakfast." She arched a brow, her gaze unwavering. Comfort isn't a priority for unregistered trespassers. Galen exhaled through his nose. "All right, Chief, let's start over. I think we got off on the wrong foot." He flexed his fingers behind his back. "How about you take these cuffs off, and we have a nice, civil conversation?" Her lips twitched, but it wasn't a smile. "Nice try." She stepped closer, her boots clicking softly against the floor. "Let's try this again. Who are you, and how did you get into my city?" "I already told you, I don't know," Galen said, his tone more serious now. "One second, I'm on Arios Prime, and the next, I'm waking up here with you glaring at me like I just broke into your house." Ashira didn't respond immediately. Her gaze bore into him, as if searching for cracks in his story. Finally, she sighed and turned toward a control panel embedded in the wall. With a press of her hand, the restraints around Galen's wrists and ankles disengaged. Generous, he thought, rubbing his wrists. "You're not a prisoner," Ashira said, her tone neutral. "Not yet. But make no mistake, you're still a security risk. Everything you do here will be monitored. Don't give me a reason to change my mind." Galen stood slowly, rolling his shoulders. "Noted. So, what now?" "You'll be escorted to a secure holding area," she said. "We'll conduct further tests and investigations to determine how you got here and why. And if I have nothing to say..." She turned to face him fully, her dark eyes unyielding. "Then I'll find another way to get my answers." Her unwavering confidence was both impressive and unnerving. Galen couldn't help but smirk, despite the circumstances. "Sounds fun." She stepped closer, closing the gap between them. "You'll be under my personal custody until we figure out who you really are and what you're doing here. Cooperate, and you might even leave this city alive." "Should I be flattered?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. Ashira didn't dignify the comment with a response. Instead, she turned and gestured for two armed enforcers to enter the room. "Escort him to the holding suite," she ordered. As the enforcers flanked him, Galen followed their lead, his mind racing. He still had no idea how he'd ended up in Oriconis or why, but one thing was clear. Ashira Driva wasn't just interested in him because he was a mystery. She thought he was dangerous, and in the depths of his soul, Galen couldn't help but wonder if she might be right. The first thing Galen noticed as the enforcers escorted him down the hallways of Oriconis was the sound. A low, constant hum that seemed to resonate through the entire structure. It wasn't unpleasant, but it added to the surreal quality of his surroundings. The corridors were pristine, their metallic walls reflecting the soft glow of overhead lights. Everything was sleek, sterile, and advanced far beyond anything Galen had seen back on Earth. "Personal custody, huh?" he muttered, breaking the silence as they rounded a corner. "I expected something more prison-like." The lead enforcer glanced back briefly but said nothing. Ashira, walking ahead of the group with her hands clasped behind her back, didn't even turn. "If you prefer a cell, I can make the arrangements," she said, her tone flat. Galen smirked, just hoping for a softer bed. Maybe a minibar. At that, Ashira did glance over her shoulder, her expression as cold and unamused as ever. "Your accommodations are not meant for comfort. They're meant for observation." They reached a set of doors at the end of the corridor. Ashira placed her hand on a glowing panel beside them, and the doors slid open with a quiet hiss. Beyond lay a room that was both more and less than Galen had expected. It wasn't a cell, exactly, but it wasn't far from one either. The suite was spacious and minimalistic, with smooth metallic walls and a reinforced glass window that offered a breathtaking view of the city beyond. Towers of shimmering light stretched into the clouds, their surfaces reflecting the swirling orange and red storms of the gas giant below. Inside, there was a small sitting area with a sleek table, an adjoining washroom, and a cot that looked functional but far from inviting. Every corner of the room was clearly designed with security in mind. No sharp edges, no loose objects, and certainly no privacy. "Welcome to your new home," Ashira said, stepping inside. She gestured toward the window. "Enjoy the view. It's the closest thing to freedom you'll have for a while." Galen arched an eyebrow. "I don't know whether to thank you or file a complaint." "You're still a security risk," she continued, ignoring his sarcasm. "Everything in this room is monitored." She tapped a control panel embedded in the wall, and a holographic display flickered to life, showing multiple angles of the suite captured by hidden cameras. "Great," Galen said, flopping onto the cot with exaggerated nonchalance. "Living in a fishbowl. Just what I've always wanted." Ashira's gaze didn't waver. "If you want privacy, earn my trust." "And how do I do that?" he asked, folding his arms behind his head. For a moment, she didn't respond. She simply studied him, her dark eyes searching his face for something he couldn't quite discern. Finally, she spoke. "We start with answers." Galen sighed and sat up, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "I already told you, I don't know how I got here. 1 second I'm on Erios Prime, trying to make sense of some ancient relic, and the next thing I know, I'm waking up in your custody." "Convenient," Ashira said, her voice cold. "It's the truth," he shot back. "And trust me, Chief, I'm just as confused as you are." Ashira's lips pressed into a thin line. She took a step closer, her imposing figure casting a shadow over him. "You don't seem particularly concerned about your situation." "Concerned? Sure. Panicked? No," Galen said with a shrug. "You're too smart to kill me without a good reason, and you're too curious to throw me in a cell and forget about me. As far as I can tell, I've got time." Her expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of something, annoyance, amusement, in her dark eyes. Without another word, she turned and walked toward the door. As she reached the threshold, she paused and glanced back over her shoulder. "You said I was too curious to throw you in a cell," she murmured. "You're not wrong." And then she was gone. The days that followed were a strange mix of monotony and tension. Galen quickly learned the rhythms of the compound, the guards' shifts, the subtle ways the security systems tracked his every move, and the exact times he was escorted to the dining hall for meals. The suite itself was a marvel of alien engineering, with walls that seemed to hum faintly in tune with the city around them. Despite its sterile design, there was an almost soothing quality to the room, if you ignored the fact that it was essentially a glorified prison. But the most interesting part of Galen's captivity wasn't the room. It was Ashira. Every day, she came to question him. At first, their conversations were strictly professional. She asked about Earth, human physiology, and the limits of his endurance. She ran tests, not invasive, but methodical, analyzing his reaction speeds, his muscle density, and even his psychological responses to various stimuli. She was thorough, relentless, and unnervingly precise. Galen did his best to keep his answers vague, not because he had anything to hide, but because he didn't trust her, or himself. The more time he spent with her, the more he realized there was something beneath her cold exterior, something she was keeping tightly controlled. And that intrigued him. One evening, after another round of questioning, Ashira lingered longer than usual. Galen leaned back against the table, his arms crossed, and watched her as she tapped away at a holographic display. "You know," he said casually, "for someone who claims to see me as a security risk, you sure spend a lot of time in here." She glanced at him, her expression unreadable. "You're under my jurisdiction." It's my responsibility to assess the threat you pose. Is that what you're doing? He asked, tilting his head. Assessing a threat. Before she could respond, a sharp knock interrupted them. The door slid open, revealing a silver-skinned enforcer. He saluted briskly. Chief Drever, urgent report. You're needed in the command center. Ashira nodded and turned to leave, but just before she stepped through the doorway, she paused. Without looking back, she said quietly, "You're not as untouchable as you think you are, human." And then she was gone. The sirens started suddenly, cutting through the still air of the suite like a blade. Galen sat up from the cot, his muscles tensed. The lights flickered once, then died completely, plunging the room into pitch blackness. The hum of the walls ceased, leaving an unsettling silence in its wake. "That's not good," he muttered, rising to his feet. A second later, the door to his suite slid open with a sharp hiss, and a figure stepped into the threshold. It was one of the enforcers, his silver skin glinting faintly in the darkness. "You," the enforcer said, his voice urgent. "Come with me. Now." Galen didn't move. Not a fan of the whole mystery evacuation thing. "What's going on?" The enforcer scowled. "The station is under attack. Chief Drever's orders are to move all high-risk individuals to a secure location." "Let me guess," Galen said, crossing his arms. "I'm the high-risk individual." "You don't have a choice," the enforcer snapped, stepping closer. Before the enforcer could grab him, Galen made his move. Pivoting sharply, he slipped past the enforcer and bolted through the open doorway. "Hey!" the enforcer shouted, but Galen was already gone, sprinting down the dimly lit corridor. His mind raced as he tried to piece together what was happening. Who was attacking the station? And why? As he rounded a corner, he heard the distinct sound of energy weapons firing. He skidded to a stop, his eyes widening as he took in the scene ahead. At the far end of the corridor, Ashira Drever stood in the middle of a clearing, her stance firm, her blaster drawn. Across from her, a figure in biomechanical armor raised a weapon. Galen didn't think. He moved. The corridor erupted in chaos. Blaster fire lit the dim hallway, streaking the air with blue and orange energy trails. Galen skidded to a stop just in time to see Ashira Drever dodge a bolt that sizzled past her shoulder. She was holding her ground, her movements precise as she returned fire, the sharp reports of her blaster echoing off the metallic walls. Across from her stood a towering figure in sleek, biomechanical armor, its angular design pulsating with an ominous red glow. The attacker moved with an unnatural fluidity, almost as if the armor were alive, each step accompanied by a faint hum of resonant energy. A weapon, something between a rifle and a blade, was mounted on its arm, firing charged bursts of plasma toward Ashira. Galen's gaze darted downward. One of Ashira's officers lay sprawled on the ground between them, motionless, a fallen blaster still clutched in his hand. Without hesitation, Galen dove for the weapon, rolling as he snatched it up. He aimed and fired in one fluid motion. The shot hit home, slamming into the attacker's shoulder. Sparks flew as the figure staggered back, its weapon briefly jerking upward and firing wildly. The stray blast scorched a line along the wall just inches from Ashira's head, but she didn't flinch. Instead, she seized the opening and charged forward, a shimmering energy blade springing to life in her hand. She moved with the speed and precision of a predator, her blade slicing through the attacker's weapon before driving into the joint of its armor. The figure collapsed to its knees with a metallic groan, but before she could deliver a finishing blow, a sudden, deafening roar filled the corridor. More attackers poured in from the shadows, their armor gleaming with the same red glow. Galen's stomach dropped. There were at least half a dozen of them, and they were all armed. Ashira turned, her blade raised, but she was already surrounded. "Get out of here," she barked at Galen without looking at him. "Not happening," he shouted back, raising his blaster. The attackers advanced, their weapons charging, and Galen fired. His first shot caught one square in the chest, sending it sprawling backward, but the others were unfazed. They returned fire, forcing him to dive for cover behind a support beam. The corridor erupted into chaos, bolts of energy flying in every direction. Ashira fought like a whirlwind, her movements impossibly fast and efficient. She deflected incoming fire with her blade, the energy field sparking with each impact. But even she couldn't keep up with the sheer number of attackers pressing in. Galen peeked out from behind the beam, his heart pounding. He could see it in her movements, the slight hesitation, the fraction of a second slower than before. She was tiring. "Damn it," he muttered, his grip tightening on the blaster. He couldn't just sit there and watch her fall. The decision to act came as naturally to Galen as breathing. He darted out from cover, firing rapidly to draw attention away from Ashira. His shots weren't particularly accurate, he was no soldier, but they were enough to force two of the attackers to shift their focus toward him. "Hey, tin cans," he shouted. "Over here." It worked. The nearest attacker turned and lunged toward him, its weapon raised. Galen's pulse thundered in his ears as he scrambled backward, firing wildly. One shot glanced off the attacker's shoulder, another hit its weapon, causing it to spark and malfunction. But the figure kept coming. Before it could reach him, Ashira appeared at his side, her blade slicing cleanly through the attacker's midsection. The armor crumpled to the floor in two smoldering pieces, and she turned to glare at him. "I told you to run," she snapped. "And let you have all the fun," he shot back, panting. Her lips tightened, but she didn't argue. Instead, she turned to face the remaining attackers. "Stay behind me," she ordered. Galen didn't argue. The fight was brutal and relentless. Ashira's blade cut through the attackers with ruthless efficiency, and Galen provided what cover fire he could. But for every enemy they took down, it seemed like two more appeared to take their place. The corridor felt like it was closing in around them, the walls shimmering with the heat of the constant blast of fire. Finally, Ashira managed to take down the last of the immediate attackers, driving her blade into its chest before twisting and pulling it free. The figure collapsed in a heap of sparking metal, and for a moment, there was silence. Galen leaned against the wall, catching his breath. His hands were shaking, and his blaster felt like it weighed a ton. "Please tell me that was the last of them." Ashira wiped the back of her hand across her forehead, though she didn't lower her weapon. "Doubtful. Come on. We need to move." "Move where?" he asked, pushing himself off the wall. She didn't answer. Instead, she grabbed his arm and pulled him forward. They made their way through the labyrinthine corridors of the compound, Ashira leading the way with her weapon at the ready. Galen followed close behind, his blaster clutched tightly in his hands. As they turned a corner, the corridor opened into a vast chamber, its ceiling stretching high above them. In the center of the room was a massive crystalline sphere, its surface pulsing with an otherworldly blue light. Energy arced between the sphere and the surrounding machinery, casting the room in a flickering glow. "What the hell is that?" Galen asked, his voice tinged with awe. "The chrono array," Ashira said without looking at him. He frowned. "Chrono array? Sounds like something out of a bad sci-fi novel." "It's a relic," she explained, stepping closer to the sphere. "One of the oldest and most dangerous artifacts we've ever encountered. It manipulates space-time." Galen's stomach dropped. "You're telling me this thing can mess with time?" "Yes. And it's why those mercenaries are here." Before he could respond, a deep, distorted voice echoed through the chamber. Well. Still playing the hero, Ashira." They both turned to see a figure stepping out of the shadows at the far end of the room. Varric Tyros, clad in armor far more advanced than the others, stood with an air of casual confidence. His helmet retracted, revealing a sharp, angular face marked by a jagged scar that ran from his temple to his jawline. "Varric," Ashira said, her voice cold. "You always were predictable," he said, smirking. "Still guarding the relics like they're sacred. But this one? It's wasted on you." His gaze shifted to Galen, and his smirk widened. "And this must be the key," Varric said, stepping closer. "The man who doesn't belong. The chrono array resonates with him. You felt it, haven't you, Ashira?" Galen frowned, his grip tightening on his blaster. "What the hell are you talking about?" "You're marked, human," Varric said, his voice dripping with mockery. The array chose you. It's responding to your presence, to your energy. You're the only one who can unlock its full potential. And you plan to use him? Ashira said, her tone sharp. Of course, Varric replied, spreading his arms. With the array's power, I can rewrite the fabric of reality itself. I can undo everything. Galen took a step back, his mind racing. Rewriting reality sounds like a bad idea. Varric chuckled darkly. It's not your choice, human. He raised his weapon, and the room erupted into chaos once more. The battle in the chamber was unlike anything Galen had ever experienced. The energy from the chrono array seemed to distort the very air around them, creating flashes of light and bursts of sound that disoriented him. Varric's movements were impossibly fast, his armor amplifying his strength and speed to inhuman levels. Ashira fought valiantly, her blade clashing with his in a shower of sparks, but it was clear she was outmatched. Meanwhile, the array pulsed brighter with every passing second, its energy surging toward Galen. He could feel it pulling at him, tugging at something deep within his chest. Galen! Ashira shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos. You have to stop it. Stop it? How? Focus, she shouted. The array is linked to you. You can control it. Galen's heart raced as he turned toward the array. Its energy engulfed him, searing through his body like fire. Time seemed to freeze as he reached out, his hand brushing against the sphere's surface. In that moment, he saw everything. His past, Ashira's buried regrets, and countless futures, each more terrifying than the last. When time resumed, Galen knew what he had to do. Time froze as Galen's hand connected with the chrono array. The crystalline sphere pulsed, sending waves of energy radiating outward. He felt an overwhelming surge of heat and cold simultaneously, as though his entire body was being pulled in 1,000 directions at once. His mind fractured under the weight of the visions cascading through him, splintered images of the past, present, and future. He saw himself standing in the ruins of Erio's Prime, the obsidian relic in his hand glowing faintly. He saw Oriconis, its towering structures crumbling into the gas giant storms. He saw Ashira, her blade raised in defiance as she stood alone against an army. And he saw Varric Tyros, victorious, his hands drenched in the blood of countless innocents as reality itself unraveled. No, Galen whispered, his voice echoing in the void around him. This isn't how it ends. A voice cut through the chaos, clear and commanding. Galen. It was Ashira. Control it. Don't let it control you. Her words anchored him, pulling him back from the brink. He focused, reaching deep within himself, and willed the energy of the array to obey him. The visions began to fade, and the searing heat in his veins cooled to a steady thrum of power. When time resumed, Varric was lunging toward him, his blade aimed directly at Galen's chest. Acting on instinct, Galen raised his hand, and a surge of blue energy erupted from the array, forming a shimmering barrier between him and the rogue engineer. Varric's blade struck the barrier and rebounded with a deafening crack, sending him staggering backward. Ashira seized the opportunity. With a fierce battle cry, she charged, her energy blade slicing through the air. Varric parried, but he was no longer in control of the fight. Galen, still connected to the array, could feel the flow of energy shifting in their favor. You've already lost, Varric, Galen said, his voice steady despite the chaos. This power isn't yours to take. Varric snarled, his composure breaking. You don't understand what you're dealing with, human. The array doesn't belong to anyone. It's a tool for shaping the universe. I'm the only one who can wield it properly. And that's the problem, Ashira interjected, her blade clashing against his. You think this is about power, but it's not. It's about responsibility. With a final, decisive strike, she drove her blade into Varric's armor, piercing through the layers of metal and circuitry. He gasped, his weapon falling from his hand as he collapsed to his knees. It's over, Ashira said, her voice cold. But Varric's lips twisted into a bitter smile. You think you've won, he rasped. The array has already begun its work. You can't stop what's coming. His body convulsed as the energy of the array pulsed again, and then he went still. Ashira turned to Galen, who was still standing near the array, his hand resting lightly on its surface. The energy coursing through him was steady now, no longer chaotic, but his face was pale, and his eyes glowed faintly with the array's power. "You need to let go," she said softly, stepping closer. "I can't," he replied, his voice strained. "It's connected to me. If I let go now, it'll destabilize, and everything will fall apart." She frowned. "What do you mean?" "The array is like a beacon," Galen explained, his words coming faster now. "It's not just manipulating time. It's broadcasting across dimensions, drawing something here. If we don't stop it, Orconis will be destroyed." Ashura's jaw tightened. "Then we shut it down." Galen shook his head. "It's not that simple. The array isn't just a machine. It's alive, in a way. It's responding to me because of whatever happened back on Erios Prime, but I don't fully understand how it works." "Then we figure it out," she said firmly. "Together." The next few minutes were a blur of motion as Ashira and Galen worked to stabilize the array. She accessed the nearby control panels, her fingers flying across the holographic interface as she bypassed security protocols and analyzed the array's core systems. Meanwhile, Galen focused on maintaining his connection, using every ounce of willpower to keep the energy in check. The visions returned, but this time they were clearer, more focused. He saw pathways branching out before him, each one representing a possible future. Some were bright, filled with hope and prosperity. Others were dark, marked by destruction and despair. "This thing is more than a weapon," Galen said, his voice tinged with awe. "It's a map, a guide to every possible outcome." Ashira glanced at him. "And which path are we on?" "The one where we stop it," he said with a faint smile. Suddenly, the array pulsed violently, sending a shockwave through the chamber. The control panels flickered, and Ashira stumbled, catching herself against the console. "What's happening?" she demanded. "It's resisting," Galen said through gritted teeth. "It doesn't want to be shut down." "Then we make it," she said, her tone resolute. Ashira's mind raced as she searched for a solution. The array's systems were ancient, their design far beyond even the advanced technology of Orconis. But there was a pattern to the energy flows, a rhythm that she could almost understand. She glanced at Galen. His face was pale, and sweat beaded on his brow, but his resolve was unwavering. "Galen," she said, her voice steady, "if we can't shut it down from here, can you control it long enough to redirect its energy?" "Redirect it where?" he asked, his eyes narrowing. "Back to where it came from," she replied. "Erios Prime." His brow furrowed. "That's a hell of a gamble. Do you have a better idea?" He hesitated, then shook his head. "All right, let's do it." Working together, they devised a plan. Ashira rerouted the array's energy conduits, creating a pathway that would channel the energy away from Orconis and back to Erios Prime. Meanwhile, Galen focused on stabilizing the array, using his connection to guide the energy flows. The room trembled as the array's power surged, and for a moment, Galen thought they might fail. But then, slowly, the energy began to shift. The blinding light dimmed, and the array's pulses grew less erratic. "It's working," Ashira said, her voice tinged with relief. "Don't celebrate yet," Galen muttered. "We're not out of the woods." Minutes felt like hours as they pushed the array to its limits. Finally, with a deafening crack, the energy surged outward, disappearing into the ether. The chamber fell silent, the array's glow fading to a faint, steady hum. Galen staggered back, his connection severed, and collapsed to his knees. Ashira was at his side in an instant, steadying him. "Is it over?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. She nodded. "For now." He managed a weak smile. "Good. Because I'm pretty sure I just pulled every muscle in my body." Ashira allowed herself a small chuckle. "You did good, Galen." In the days that followed, Orikonis began to recover. The city's systems were repaired, and the remaining mercenaries were apprehended. Varek's body was removed from the chamber, his ambitions finally extinguished. Galen, though exhausted, found himself at the center of attention. Scientists and officials alike were eager to study his connection to the chrono array, but he kept them at arm's length, preferring to spend his time with Ashira. One evening, as they stood on a balcony overlooking the city, he turned to her. "You think they'll come back for it?" he asked. "Eventually," she said. "Power like that doesn't stay hidden for long." He nodded. "Then I guess I'd better stick around." She glanced at him, a faint smile playing at her lips. "I thought you might say that." As they stood together, the storms of Arius swirling below, Galen felt a strange sense of peace. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he felt ready to face it. And so, the story of Galen Stroud and Ashira Driva began. A story of discovery, defiance, and the fragile balance between power and responsibility.